Close your eyes for a moment and listen. Can you hear it? The gentle crackle of a fire in a stone hearth, the distant, solemn toll of a church bell echoing across a frost-kissed valley. This is Lorraine, in the heart of the Middle Ages, a land of deep forests and whispered secrets. It is a time when the line between the earthly and the ethereal was thin as parchment, and shadows held as much power as sunlight. And from these shadows emerges a figure so haunting, her story has refused to fade with the centuries. She is known only as the Witch Queen of Lorraine, a name that conjures images of dark rituals and forbidden power, a title spoken in fear and fascination for generations. What kind of woman could earn such a fearsome reputation? Was she a malevolent sorceress, a political pawn, or something else entirely, a victim of her own ambition or the superstitions of her age? This is not just a ghost story. The legend of the Witch Queen is a tangled skein of historical fact and chilling folklore, a mystery that has puzzled scholars and storytellers alike. We are about to embark on a journey to separate the woman from the myth, to walk the same cobbled streets she might have walked, and to understand the world that could create such a dark and enduring legend. We will delve into ancient chronicles, examine the whispers of witchcraft that swirled around her, and ask the difficult questions about power, fear, and how a person can be transformed into a monster in the eyes of history. This is a story about the secrets that history tries to bury and the truths that insist on clawing their way back into the light. So settle in as we pull back the veil on one of the medieval era's most captivating and chilling tales. We are going to explore the dark heart of a legend, to meet the enigmatic figure at its center, and to uncover the real story behind the Witch Queen of Lorraine. This is a journey into the unknown, a search for a truth that is far more complex and fascinating than any simple fairy tale. The fire is lit, the night is deep, and the story is waiting to be told. To understand the legend of the Witch Queen, we must first step into her world, a world far removed from our own. Picture the Duchy of Lorraine not as a unified nation, but as a fragile patchwork of territories caught between the rising powers of France and the Holy Roman Empire. This was a borderland in every sense, a place where political loyalties shifted like the fog in its deep valleys. There was no strong central authority to impose order or justice. Instead, local lords and bishops vied for control, their petty squabbles creating a constant undercurrent of violence and uncertainty for the common people. In this climate, trust was a scarce commodity, and your neighbor could easily become your accuser, and the lives of those common people were defined by a pervasive, bone-deep fear. Their existence was precarious, tethered to the land and the mercy of the seasons. A single failed harvest could plunge an entire village into famine. But an even greater terror lurked just beyond the edge of the known world, the Black Death. The plague had swept through Europe in the previous century, wiping out entire communities and leaving a traumatized population in its wake. Its cause was a mystery, its cure unknown. In the absence of scientific understanding, people searched for a reason, for someone or something to blame for such incomprehensible suffering. It was far easier to believe the plague was a punishment from God for their sins, or worse, the malicious work of a hidden evil in their midst, than to accept it as a random act of nature. This spiritual anxiety was amplified by the landscape itself. Lorraine was a land of immense, ancient forests, the Forêt de Rhénie and the Vosges Mountains. These were not places of recreation, but dark, impenetrable realms that pressed in on small, isolated villages. Sunlight struggled to reach the forest floor, and the sounds were unfamiliar: the snap of a branch when no one was there, the strange cry of an unseen animal. In the peasant imagination, these woods were not empty. They were the dwelling places of spirits, demons, and fairies, a shadowy world parallel to their own where the normal rules of God and man did not apply. It was along the shadowy paths of these forests that people believed witches traveled to their blasphemous Sabbaths. This combination of political instability, the trauma of plague, and a superstitious worldview created a powder keg. All that was needed was a spark. That spark was provided by the Church. In the 15th century, a new and terrifying idea began to take hold, crystallized in texts like the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches. This book provided a detailed and utterly fantastical blueprint of a witch's powers and a systematic guide for their prosecution. It taught that witches were not just harmless old women with herbal knowledge. They were heretics in league with the devil, capable of summoning storms, killing livestock, and stealing the virility of men. This official sanction from religious authorities gave people a language for their fears and a license to act upon them. In the villages of Lorraine, where every unexplained illness or sudden death was a potential catastrophe, the concept of witchcraft offered a simple, terrifying explanation. It was into this world, a world perpetually braced for disaster and eager to find a scapegoat, that the story of the Witch Queen was born. Against this backdrop of simmering fear, the first whispers of the Witch Queen began to circulate. Unlike many medieval legends that seemed to appear fully formed in a single chronicle, her story emerged slowly, seeping up from the collective anxieties of the people like a mist from the damp soil of Lorraine. The earliest traces are frustratingly faint, found not in the grand histories of kings but in the margins of local church ledgers, in the cryptic notes of traveling physicians, and in the court records of minor lords dealing with property disputes. These fragments rarely mention a witch queen by that explicit title. Instead, they hint at a noblewoman of significant influence, someone whose sudden rise or controversial actions drew suspicion. Perhaps she was a widow who successfully defended her lands against an aggressive male relative, an act of female autonomy that defied the rigid social order. Or maybe she was known for her knowledge of healing herbs, a practice that, while beneficial, could quickly be recast as diabolical sorcery if a patient took a turn for the worse. The transformation from a whispered name into a full-blown legend was fueled by two powerful forces, the spoken word and the preached sermon. Traveling merchants and pilgrims carried tales from village to village. Around campfires and in crowded taverns, a story would be told of a noble lady in a remote castle who commanded strange spirits. With each retelling, the details would grow more vivid and more terrifying. A simple knack for predicting weather became the power to summon hailstorms that destroyed a rival's crops. A successful herbal remedy became a potion brewed from forbidden ingredients under a full moon. The human imagination, especially when fueled by fear, is a potent amplifier, and the story of this mysterious woman was amplified into something monstrous. But the most significant catalyst was likely the local clergy. In an age where the church held immense sway over daily life, a fiery sermon could ignite a community. A priest seeking to explain a recent misfortune or to reinforce his own spiritual authority might point to the existence of a great evil in their midst. He wouldn't need to name names directly. A vague reference to a powerful servant of Satan residing in a nearby castle was enough. His congregation, already primed by folklore and hardship, would instantly know who he meant. This ecclesiastical endorsement gave the legend a sheen of divine truth, moving it from the realm of superstitious gossip to a perceived spiritual threat. The legend of the Witch Queen was no longer just a story. It was, in the minds of many, a confirmed reality, a dark secret that everyone knew but few dared to speak aloud in the light of day. And so we arrive at the central, haunting question of this entire mystery: who was she? We have painted the backdrop of fear and superstition. We have heard the whispers grow into a roar, but what name did those whispers actually speak? Peering through the fog of 5 centuries to identify the specific woman branded the Witch Queen is a task fraught with difficulty, a historical detective story where the case files are mostly dust and rumor. Historians have, however, put forward several compelling candidates, each representing a different facet of the kind of woman who might attract such a dangerous label in medieval Lorraine. One of the most prominent figures put forward is Catherine de Hauteville, a noblewoman from the late 15th century. Her story is a classic tale of power and persecution. As a widow, Catherine would have been in a uniquely vulnerable yet potentially autonomous position. She would have controlled her own lands and wealth, a situation that could easily threaten male relatives or neighboring lords who coveted her property. A woman asserting her legal rights, refusing to remarry according to a family's political strategy, or simply managing her estate with competence could be seen as dangerously unconventional. In such a climate, accusing a troublesome widow of witchcraft was a brutally effective way to discredit her, strip her of her possessions, and remove her as an obstacle. The legend of the Witch Queen, in this interpretation, becomes a weapon of patriarchal and political suppression, a slanderous story designed to destroy a woman who dared to wield power on her own terms. Another possibility points not to the high nobility, but to a figure of a very different kind, the local wise woman or healer. In villages across Lorraine, there were women who possessed a deep, empirical knowledge of herbs and midwifery passed down through generations. They were the doctors of their communities, tending to the sick, aiding in childbirth, and providing remedies for everything from fever to famine. But their knowledge was a double-edged sword. If a child they treated died, or if a rival's illness worsened, gratitude could quickly curdle into suspicion. How did she know which route to use? Why did her potion work when prayers did not? In the paranoid eyes of the church, this practical, earth-based knowledge could be reimagined as a pact with the devil. The queen, in her title, then, might not refer to royal blood, but to a position of unrivaled authority within the hidden world of folk medicine, a queen of healers, maliciously recast by her accusers as a queen of witches. There is a third, more speculative theory that she may have been a woman from a marginalized group, such as the Romani people who traveled through Europe. Outsiders have always been easy targets for collective fear, and a charismatic woman from a community that was already viewed with distrust and mystery could easily become the focal point for local anxieties. Her different customs, language, and appearance would set her apart, making her a perfect canvas onto which a community could project its deepest terrors about the unknown. The frustrating truth is that the hard evidence for any single candidate is vanishingly small. We are left with echoes, not facts. A property record might show a transfer of land from a woman with a suspicious reputation following her trial. A church account might note an unusually large expense for an execution, but these documents rarely state the reason for the trial or the nature of the accusations in detail. The historical record is like a palimpsest, an ancient parchment scraped clean and written over. The original story of the Witch Queen has been partially erased, and what remains are the faint, ghostly traces of her name, layered over with the much clearer, darker ink of the legend that consumed her. We may never know her true identity with absolute certainty, and perhaps that is the point. The power of the Witch Queen lies not in her specific biography, but in what she represents, the terrifying ease with which a woman, any woman, could be transformed from a person into a monster by the fears of her time. These whispered suspicions, once given voice by her accusers, coalesced into a formal and terrifying catalogue of crimes. The charges laid against the Witch Queen were not mere trifles. They were a comprehensive indictment designed to portray her as the ultimate enemy of God, nature, and the social order itself. At the heart of the accusations was the claim of a demonic pact. It was said she had willingly renounced her baptism and sworn her soul to a powerful demon, often described as a tall, shadowy figure she called her master. In exchange, she was granted supernatural abilities, turning her from a mere woman into a conduit for cosmic evil. This was the foundational charge, the one that transformed all her subsequent alleged actions from simple mischief into high treason against heaven. Her supposed powers were then enumerated with chilling specificity. She was accused of maleficia, the harmful magic that struck directly at the heart of a medieval community's fragile existence. If a sudden hailstorm flattened a village's wheat fields just before harvest, her accusers claimed she had summoned the tempest, perhaps by stirring a cauldron of water with a specific stick or chanting curses into the wind. When a healthy child succumbed to a fever overnight, it was not a tragic illness but the result of the Witch Queen's evil eye, a malevolent glance that could curse a person from a distance. The unexplained deaths of livestock, a family's only cow found dead in its stall, were attributed to her poisonous touch or a curse woven from the hair of the animal. In a world with no concept of germs or weather systems, these misfortunes required an explanation, and the Witch Queen provided a terrifyingly simple one: intentional personal malice. The accusations grew even more grandiose, suggesting her influence extended to the highest levels of power. Whispers claimed she led a vast coven of lesser witches, presiding over blasphemous nocturnal gatherings known as witches' sabbats. These were described in lurid detail by the inquisitors who sought her. Under the cold light of the moon, deep within the forbidden forests, she and her followers were said to feast on grotesque foods, dance naked in a frenzied circle, and profane the holy sacraments in a mockery of the Mass. The most shocking claim was that they paid homage to the devil himself, who appeared in the form of a giant black goat or a monstrous man. This narrative served a crucial purpose. It framed her not as a lone operator, but as the leader of a secret, subversive organization that threatened to corrupt the entire duchy from within. Perhaps the most politically dangerous charge of all was that she plotted against the Duke of Lorraine himself. This moved her crimes from the realm of superstition into that of outright sedition. An accusation of poisoning the Duke's wine or crafting a wax figurine to cause him agonizing pain was no longer just about witchcraft, it was an act of high treason. This charge would have guaranteed the involvement of secular authorities, ensuring her fate was sealed not only by the church but by the state. It reveals how the legend of the Witch Queen was likely manipulated by her enemies. By linking her to a threat against the ruling lord, they could justify the most severe punishment and eliminate a political rival under the unimpeachable guise of defending both the crown and the cross. Her alleged crimes were a perfect mirror of the deepest fears of the age: fear of famine, fear of disease, fear of the devil, and fear of political chaos. The Witch Queen, in the eyes of her accusers, was the personification of all these anxieties rolled into one. To truly grasp the weight of these accusations, we must look beyond the supernatural claims and into the cold, hard realities of medieval politics. The charge of witchcraft was not merely a matter of superstition. It was often a devastatingly effective political weapon. In the fractured world of the Duchy of Lorraine, where authority was constantly contested, eliminating a rival could be as simple as branding them a servant of the devil. Consider the immense power a noble widow like Catherine de Hauteville would have wielded. She controlled land, wealth, and the loyalty of those who lived on her estates. For a male relative with a weaker claim, or for a neighboring lord eyeing her fertile fields, a legal battle over inheritance could be long and costly. But a whisper of witchcraft, especially one amplified by a cooperative local priest, could achieve the same result with brutal efficiency. A formal accusation would immediately strip her of her rights and property, placing both in the hands of the authorities while she awaited trial, a trial she was almost certain to lose given the climate of fear. Her land could then be conveniently redistributed to her accusers, all under the righteous guise of purging evil from the community. This transforms the legend from a simple horror story into a chilling case study of how greed and ambition could wear the mask of piety. The political intrigue extended far beyond local squabbles. Lorraine itself was a strategic pawn in a much larger game, a coveted territory on the border between the Kingdom of France and the Holy Roman Empire. Both powers sought to exert influence over the duchy, and internal stability was often not in their interest. a weak, internally divided Lorraine was easier to manipulate. In this context, a figure like the Witch Queen could be a useful tool for powerful external actors. By secretly encouraging or financing allegations against a prominent local figure who was loyal to one faction, an opposing faction could create chaos and discredit their enemies. The resulting scandal would undermine the current Duke's authority, making him appear unable to control the devilry in his own backyard and potentially open the door for a political takeover. The witch hunt, therefore, can be seen as a proxy war where the battle was not fought with armies on a field, but with whispers in a courtroom with the very soul of the Duchy as the prize. This manipulation was facilitated by a legal system that was ripe for abuse. The procedures for trying a witch, heavily influenced by texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, were stacked overwhelmingly against the accused. Testimony was often accepted from witnesses of questionable character, while the accused was denied any real means of defense. The use of torture to extract a confession was not just permitted but encouraged, as it was believed the devil would prevent a witch from telling the truth willingly. This created a closed loop of guilt. The accusation itself was seen as evidence, and the torture would inevitably produce the confession that proved the accusation was true. For a political actor, this system was perfect. Once the allegation was made, the machinery of justice would almost guarantee a conviction, permanently silencing an opponent and sending a stark warning to others who might challenge the established order. The story of the Witch Queen, when viewed through this lens, becomes a stark reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not those who lurk in the shadows of the forest, but those who sit in positions of power, willing to destroy lives to serve their own ambitions. But to truly grasp how these accusations could hold such power, we must turn our attention to an institution that wielded absolute authority over the medieval soul, the Church. It was the Church, and specifically the rising power of the Inquisition, that provided the philosophical framework and the legal machinery that transformed local superstitions into a deadly, state-sanctioned crusade. The idea of witchcraft was not simply a folk belief. It was, in the eyes of the clergy, a sophisticated and terrifying heresy, a direct assault on the divine order itself. The theological foundation for this belief rested on a binary view of the universe, a constant cosmic struggle between the forces of God and the legions of Satan. Every human soul was a battleground in this war, and a witch was seen as the ultimate traitor, someone who had not merely sinned but had actively sworn allegiance to the enemy. This wasn't just about causing a hailstorm, it was about spiritual treason, a crime far worse than any earthly offense. This worldview was codified and spread with terrifying efficiency by a key text, the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches, published in 1487. This book, written by a German Dominican monk, became the unofficial handbook for witch hunters across Europe. It presented a detailed and utterly chilling blueprint of a witch's powers, methods, and how to prosecute them. The Malleus argued with twisted logic that women were particularly susceptible to the devil's temptations due to their feebler minds and insatiable carnal lust. It provided a step-by-step guide for interrogations, endorsing the use of torture to extract confessions, under the grim rationale that the devil would numb a witch to pain, so any sign of suffering was proof of her innocence, while a confession under duress was considered valid. This manual gave local authorities, who might have been otherwise skeptical, a sense of scientific and religious certainty. They weren't just torturing a frightened woman, they were following a prescribed method to save her soul and protect the community. At the local level, the role of the parish priest was absolutely critical in shaping the legend of the Witch Queen. These men were not distant theologians, they were the spiritual and often the only educated figures in a peasant's life. Their sermons, delivered in the echoing stillness of the village church, had the power to define reality for their flock. A priest seeking to explain a series of poor harvests, a stillborn calf, or an outbreak of fever might point to a spiritual cause. He could preach about the presence of a great evil, a powerful servant of Satan living in arrogance in a nearby castle. He wouldn't need to name the Witch Queen directly. His congregation, steeped in the same rumors, would connect the dots themselves. This gave the whispers an air of divine confirmation. What was once tavern gossip was now a concern voiced from the pulpit, transforming suspicion into a righteous cause. Furthermore, the Inquisition created a self-perpetuating cycle of fear and denunciation. The promise of leniency or spiritual reward for those who came forward to confess their own dalliances with dark forces and name their accomplices turned neighbor against neighbor. A person accused of a minor transgression might be coerced into naming the Witch Queen as the ringleader of a local coven in a desperate attempt to save themselves. This process generated a cascade of accusations that seemed to corroborate each other, creating the illusion of a vast, interconnected conspiracy. The Inquisition's methods manufactured the very evidence it claimed to be uncovering, building a terrifying case against a figure who may have originally been targeted for purely political or personal reasons. The Church, therefore, did not just respond to the hysteria, it actively cultivated and amplified it, providing the language, the logic, and the legal violence necessary to turn a local legend into a historical tragedy. With the political and religious machinery set firmly against her, the accused woman now faced the ultimate crucible, the trial itself. If historical records of such a specific proceeding are scarce, we can reconstruct its grim contours from the well-documented patterns of witch trials across Europe. The setting would not have been a grand, impartial hall of justice, but more likely a cramped, dark chamber in a local lord's castle or a stark church tribunal room. The air would have been thick with the smell of sweat, fear, and the smoke from a single torch, its flickering light casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to give life to the demons everyone believed were present. The judges, a panel of clerics and stern-faced secular officials, were not neutral arbiters. They were prosecutors in robes, already convinced of her guilt before a single word was spoken. Their purpose was not to determine if she was a witch, but to force her to confirm the truth they already held. The proceedings were a grotesque parody of justice, designed not to uncover facts but to validate fear. The evidence presented would have been a catalogue of the absurd, yet terrifyingly persuasive to a superstitious mind. Neighbors might testify that their milk had soured on the day they had a disagreement with the accused. Others would swear they saw her spirit, her so-called spectral evidence, wandering at night while her physical body lay asleep, a claim impossible to disprove. The most damning proof was the search for the witch's mark. This was believed to be a spot on the body, insensible to pain, where the devil had sealed his pact, often thought to be a supernumerary nipple from which a witch's familiar spirit would suckle. A panel of matrons would examine the accused woman's naked body, probing for any mole, scar, or blemish that could be labeled as the devil's teat. In an age where most peasants bore the marks of hard labor and poor hygiene, finding such a sign was a foregone conclusion. But the centerpiece of this legal nightmare was the interrogation, a euphemism for systematic torture. The use of pain was not merely punishment, it was a theological tool. Inquisitors operated under the grim belief that the devil would numb his followers to suffering, preventing them from confessing and saving their souls. Therefore, inflicting agony was framed as an act of spiritual mercy, a necessary evil to break the demonic grip and force the truth to surface. The methods were chillingly methodical. It might begin with the strappado, where the accused's hands were tied behind her back and she was hoisted into the air by a rope, dislocating her shoulders with a sickening pop. If that failed, there were thumb screws to crush fingers, or the leg screws, known as boots, that could splinter the bones of the shins. With each turn of the screw, the interrogators would demand not just a confession of guilt, but the names of accomplices, thereby weaving the web of the alleged coven wider. The ultimate goal was a detailed public confession, a narrative that satisfied the community's need for an explanation for their suffering. Broken in body and spirit, the accused would often capitulate, recounting whatever fantastical story the judges suggested. She would admit to flying on a broomstick to a sabbat, to kissing the devil's backside, to brewing poisons from the fat of unbaptized babies. This confession, extracted under unimaginable duress, was then celebrated as a victory for divine justice. It transformed the victim from a human being into a symbol of the evil that had been purged, providing a twisted sense of closure and safety to a terrified populace. The trial was never about truth. It was a public exorcism, a ritual of purification where the destruction of one life was offered as a sacrifice to calm the collective fears of the many. And so, after the agony of the rack and the psychological torment of relentless questioning, a confession would finally be extracted. On the surface, this document would appear to be the ultimate proof, the smoking gun that confirmed every dark suspicion about the Witch Queen. She would have admitted to everything: the pact with the devil, the nocturnal sabbats, the maleficent spells that blighted crops and cursed children. But we must confront a deeply unsettling question. Can any statement made under the threat of prolonged and excruciating pain ever be considered a truthful account? The confession, rather than a window into her soul, is more likely a distorted mirror reflecting the darkest fears and rigid expectations of her inquisitors. It was a performance, a script written by the persecutors and recited by a broken victim. When we examine the content of these confessions, a startling pattern emerges across thousands of cases from this era. They are not unique, personal stories of individual experience with the occult. Instead, they are filled with standardized, almost formulaic details that read like a checklist from the Malleus Maleficarum. The accused would invariably describe meeting a dark, often handsome man who promised them power and riches in exchange for their soul and the renunciation of their faith. They would mention flying through the night air on a stick or an animal to a secret gathering. They would confess to engaging in grotesque feasts and wild, orgiastic dances, and to paying homage to the devil by kissing his often ice-cold or grotesque backside. The consistency of these details across different cases in different regions is not evidence of a widespread, organized cult. It is proof of a shared cultural script, a template of what a witch was supposed to be and do, a narrative that interrogators relentlessly suggested to their prisoners until they adopted it as their own. The process of coercion was often insidiously subtle. An interrogator wouldn't just ask, "Did you meet the devil?" He would ask, "In what form did the devil appear to you? Was he a handsome man or a monstrous beast?" This leading question presupposes the devil's existence and involvement, forcing the accused to merely choose from a menu of pre-approved options. If the prisoner denied the meeting entirely, the torture would intensify. But if she offered a detail, perhaps exhausted, she muttered, "A black dog," the inquisitor would seize upon it with grim satisfaction, writing it down as confirmed fact and then pressing for more. "And what did the dog say to you? What did you promise him?" The confession was thus a collaborative effort, a story built piece by painful piece, with the inquisitor providing the outline and the victim, in a state of utter despair, filling in the blanks just to make the pain stop. It was a narrative designed not to discover the truth, but to confirm a pre-existing theory. For the authorities and the terrified public, however, this coerced narrative served a crucial psychological purpose. It provided a coherent explanation for the chaotic and suffering-filled world they inhabited. A detailed confession that spoke of summoned storms and demonic pacts gave a name and a face to the abstract terrors of famine, plague, and infant mortality. It created a satisfying story arc. Evil had been identified, confronted, and was about to be purged from the community, restoring a sense of order and safety. The fact that the story was fabricated was irrelevant. Its social utility in calming collective anxiety was what mattered. The confession of the Witch Queen, therefore, tells us very little about the woman herself, but it offers a heartbreakingly vivid portrait of the medieval mindset, a world so desperate for control and meaning that it would willingly accept a lie torn from a tortured body as the ultimate truth. Of all the accusations leveled against the Witch Queen, none was more central or more damning than the alleged demonic pact. This was the charge that elevated her from a mere practitioner of harmful magic to an arch-heretic, a traitor to heaven itself. The specifics of this pact, as described in the confessions forced from her and others, provide a chilling window into the medieval understanding of how Satan operated in their world. It was never a simple transaction. It was a grotesque parody of the sacred covenant between God and humanity, a dark baptism that inverted every holy rite. The initiation was said to have taken place at a witch's sabbat, deep within the forbidden heart of the forest. Here, the story goes, the Witch Queen would have renounced her Christian faith in the most explicit and blasphemous terms. She was said to have trampled on a crucifix, spat upon the host, and formally dedicated her soul to Satan, often by signing a contract written in her own blood. The devil, in turn, did not appear as a horned monster in these early accounts, but often as a handsome, charismatic man, a dark gentleman who offered power, wealth, and protection in exchange for her eternal loyalty. This was a crucial detail, reflecting the theological belief that Satan was a deceiver, an angel of light who could appear in pleasing forms to seduce the weak-willed. The favors he granted were meticulously tailored to tempt an ambitious woman. She might receive a familiar spirit, an imp or small animal like a cat or a toad that would act as her servant and spy. She was promised the ability to summon storms to destroy her enemies' crops, to make herself invisible to move through the world unseen, and to brew potions that could control the minds and affections of those around her. But the most terrifying power, and the one that struck at the very foundation of medieval society, was the alleged ability to steal the virility of men. This accusation, detailed extensively in texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, reveals a deep-seated anxiety about female power over male potency. It was believed a witch could, through a spell or a glance, render a husband impotent, effectively destroying a marriage and preventing the birth of heirs, the very basis of lineage and property inheritance. For a woman accused of being a queen among witches, this power was thought to be magnified, enabling her to undermine the patriarchal order from within. The pact, therefore, was not just about personal gain. In the eyes of her accusers, it was a strategic weapon aimed at the heart of the social and biological fabric of the community. The terms of this infernal agreement were always portrayed as brutally one-sided. While the Witch Queen might enjoy earthly power for a time, the ultimate price was her soul, which was promised to an eternity of torment in hell. This narrative served a dual purpose for the Church. It explained the unexplained misfortunes of daily life while also reinforcing the ultimate consequences of straying from the faith, creating a powerful deterrent wrapped in a terrifying story. The legend of the Witch Queen would be fearsome enough if she were a solitary sorceress, but the accusations painted a far more terrifying picture, that of a ringleader, a mastermind at the center of a sprawling conspiracy. The claim that she commanded a vast coven was essential to framing her as a truly existential threat to the Duchy. This wasn't just one woman dabbling in dark arts. This was an organized, secret society operating in the shadows, a hidden enemy within the very villages and towns of Lorraine. But who were these alleged followers? The descriptions from coerced confessions suggest a disturbing cross-section of society, revealing how the panic could ensnare almost anyone. The core of her coven was said to be composed of other women, often those who lived on the margins, the elderly widow who kept to herself, the midwife whose knowledge of childbirth was viewed with suspicion, or the outspoken wife who challenged her husband's authority. These were the individuals Chinese letter targeted, their social vulnerability making them perfect candidates for recruitment by the devil, or so the logic went. Yet the net of suspicion was cast even wider. Men were not immune to accusation. The confessions sometimes named men as part of the Witch Queen's inner circle, often those who were also outsiders in their communities: the wandering laborer, the herbalist who competed with the local priest for healing souls, or the skeptical intellectual who questioned church doctrines. Even more chilling were the sporadic accusations involving children. In the heightened atmosphere of a witch panic, a child's fantastical story, perhaps fueled by fear or a desire for attention, could be taken as divine truth. A young boy or girl might claim to have been lured to a sabbat by the beautiful queen, given sweetmeats, and forced to participate in blasphemous rites. These accusations involving the young were particularly potent, as they played upon the deepest fears of parents for the safety and purity of their children's souls, making the Witch Queen's threat seem not only present but generational, poisoning the very future of the community. This phenomenon of a rapidly expanding list of accomplices is a classic hallmark of what historians now call social contagion. A witch panic operates like a psychological virus, spreading through a community not by fact but by suggestion and fear. It begins with a single, shocking accusation, often against a prominent or controversial figure like the Witch Queen. This first accusation breaks a social taboo, making it permissible to voice previously unthinkable suspicions. Then, the legal process, with its promise of leniency for those who confess and name others, actively incentivizes the spread. A person accused of a minor supernatural offense, like using a love charm, might be tortured until they not only admit to greater crimes but also implicate their neighbors, their rivals, or even family members in a desperate attempt to end their own suffering. Each new name extracted under duress seemed to validate the original allegation, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of guilt. The conspiracy grew not because it was real, but because the mechanics of the persecution demanded that it grow. The idea of a hierarchical coven, with the Witch Queen at its apex, also served a crucial psychological function for the accusers. It provided a satisfyingly organized explanation for the random and chaotic misfortunes that plagued their lives. A single witch might be blamed for a specific illness or a localized hailstorm, but a network of witches directed by a brilliant and malevolent queen could explain everything: a plague sweeping the region, a series of failed harvests, political instability, and the general sense of divine abandonment. This narrative transformed a world of incomprehensible suffering into a world with a clear antagonist and a logical, if evil, plot. Defeating the Witch Queen and her coven wasn't just about punishing a criminal. It was about restoring cosmic order, about winning a war against a tangible, structured enemy. The vastness of her alleged following was, in a twisted sense, a measure of the vastness of the community's own fears, a dark mirror reflecting their collective anxiety about the fragility of their world. The accusations of harmful magic or maleficia leveled against the Witch Queen were not vague allegations of dark power. They were terrifyingly specific, a detailed catalogue of how her supernatural malice was believed to have bled into the everyday lives of the common people. These were not crimes against the state in the abstract, but intimate attacks on the very foundations of survival in a medieval village. At the top of this grim list was her alleged power over the weather, a force upon which every life depended. In an age utterly reliant on agriculture, a single hailstorm at the wrong moment could mean the difference between a winter of full bellies and a season of starvation. When such a storm did arrive, flattening a field of nearly ripe wheat, the peasants did not see a random act of nature. They saw the conscious, vindictive will of the Witch Queen. The stories claimed she would summon these tempests by performing a simple yet blasphemous ritual, perhaps stirring a pot of water with a specific stick stolen from a churchyard, or chanting curses into the wind while standing at a crossroads at midnight. This accusation transformed a natural disaster into a personal assault, giving a terrified community a villain to blame for their impending hunger. Her supposed abilities extended directly into the home and the human body. The death of livestock was a catastrophic event for a peasant family, as a cow or a pig represented not just food but a significant portion of their wealth. An animal found dead in its stall with no obvious cause was not seen as a simple illness. It was the work of the evil eye. It was said the Witch Queen could curse a beast with a single malevolent glare, her envy or anger enough to still a heart from across a field. Even more frightening were the accusations involving children. In a time of shocking infant mortality, the sudden fever or mysterious seizure of a child was an all too common tragedy. In the absence of medical understanding, the inexplicable had to be explained, and the finger of suspicion pointed toward the woman in the castle. Whispers said she used enchanted poisons, brewed from foul ingredients under the full moon to sicken those who crossed her. Or, in a more spectral form of attack, she was believed to create a small wax or clay figurine, a puppet, into which she would stick pins while chanting the name of her victim, causing them to suffer agonizing pains from a distance. This form of maleficia made her power feel omnipresent and inescapable, a threat that could penetrate the very walls of one's home. One of the most persistent and visually striking images associated with her legend is that of flight. It was widely believed that witches could travel vast distances to attend their nocturnal sabbats by flying through the night air. The Witch Queen's vehicle of choice, according to the tales, was not the stereotypical broomstick but a distaff, a common household tool used by women for spinning wool. This detail is profoundly revealing. The distaff was a symbol of female domestic labor and authority within the home. By transforming this ordinary object of women's work into an instrument of supernatural travel, the legend inverted its meaning, turning a symbol of productive, domestic order into a vehicle for chaotic, blasphemous activity. The stories described her anointing the distaff with a magical flying ointment, a potent salve made from hallucinogenic herbs like belladonna and henbane, which could induce sensations of flying and transformation. This belief offered a twisted logic. The ointment didn't enable physical flight, but it could create a powerful, vivid dream state in which the user truly believed they were soaring through the sky to meet the devil. For her accusers, however, this was no dream. It was concrete evidence of her ability to defy the laws of God and nature. Beyond these direct acts of harm, she was accused of more subtle, insidious forms of magic that attacked the social and emotional fabric of the community. Love potions and charms were a double-edged sword. A young woman might secretly seek a potion to win the affections of a desired suitor, but if that marriage later turned sour or ended in tragedy, the initial potion could be reinterpreted as a malicious spell that H-a-D Chinese letter ED the man's free will. The Witch Queen was said to be a master of such enchantments, capable of sowing discord within families by inflaming passions or, conversely, by creating frigid indifference between husband and wife. This accusation highlights how maleficia was often the language used to explain the complex, painful, and unpredictable dynamics of human relationships, the jealousies, the betrayals, the failed romances that had no other easy explanation. Every personal misfortune, from a soured friendship to a barren field, could be laid at her feet, building a mountain of circumstantial evidence that, in the fevered imagination of the time, became an unassailable proof of her guilt and the terrifying reach of her dark power. Yet, amidst this chorus of condemnation and fear, the historical record does contain faint but crucial whispers of dissent. The notion that an entire society unanimously believed in the witch trials is a modern simplification. In the shadows of the frenzy, there were indeed individuals who questioned the proceedings, though their voices were often cautious, muted by the immense risk of speaking out. To challenge a witch hunt was to risk being labeled a witch's sympathizer or worse, a secret accomplice. The most likely source of skepticism came not from the peasantry, but from within the ranks of the powerful themselves. A pragmatic local lord, for instance, might have viewed the accusations with a weary cynicism. His primary concern was the stability and productivity of his lands. If a valuable, productive tenant, a skilled blacksmith, or a successful farmer was suddenly accused of witchcraft by a jealous neighbor, the lord stood to lose a source of tax revenue and labor. From this practical standpoint, the supernatural claims were a nuisance, a disruption to the earthly order that affected his bottom line. He might intervene not out of a belief in justice, but out of a desire to protect his own economic interests, questioning the credibility of the accuser rather than the entire framework of witchcraft itself. Within the church, too, there were pockets of reasoned debate, though they were often isolated. While the Malleus Maleficarum was influential, it was never officially endorsed by the Vatican, and several prominent theologians and canon lawyers expressed serious reservations about its methods and its fantastical claims. These men argued from a position of doctrinal purity, concerned that the rampant accusations and reliance on torture were leading to gross injustices that would ultimately damage the Church's credibility. They pointed out that many of the alleged powers of witches, such as flying or transforming into animals, were logically impossible and likely illusions created by the devil to deceive the faithful. Their argument was a nuanced one. The devil was real and sought to deceive humanity, but the idea that old women were physically flying to sabbats was a dangerous superstition that distracted from true spiritual warfare. A particularly rational cleric might have privately doubted the spectral evidence presented against the Witch Queen, understanding that dreams and coerced visions were not proof of actual events. However, voicing such doubts publicly was extraordinarily dangerous, as it could be interpreted as a denial of the devil's power, which was itself a heretical position. This created a stifling intellectual climate where even internal skepticism was forced into silence. Perhaps the most poignant potential defenders would have been those who knew the accused woman personally. Family members, loyal servants, or long-time neighbors who had witnessed her daily life for years would have struggled to reconcile the monstrous image of the Witch Queen with the real person they knew. They might have seen her acts of charity, her worries for her children, or her simple human frailties. A servant could testify that she attended Mass regularly. A neighbor might attest to her kindness during a previous famine. Yet, in the fevered atmosphere of a trial, such testimony in her defense was not just unlikely to be heard, it was actively perilous. Anyone who spoke up for the accused risked immediate suspicion falling upon themselves. The legal process was stacked against defense witnesses. Their character would be assassinated, their motives questioned. Were they under her magical thrall? Had they, too, been seduced by the devil, the very act of defense could be twisted into proof of a wider conspiracy. This terrifying dynamic effectively silenced the very people who might have offered a humanizing portrait, isolating the accused completely and allowing the legend of the monster to completely overwrite the reality of the person. The absence of loud, public defenders in the historical record is not proof that no one doubted. It is a stark testament to the overwhelming power of fear that made doubt a potentially fatal luxury. Following the grim formality of the trial and the extraction of a confession, the machinery of justice would have moved to its final, irreversible stage. The punishment for a conviction of witchcraft, especially one as grave as that leveled against the Witch Queen, was almost invariably death by burning at the stake. This was not a private act of disposal. It was a meticulously orchestrated public spectacle, a ritual of immense social and religious significance designed to achieve far more than merely ending a life. The entire community would have been compelled to attend, from the highest local lord to the lowest peasant, transforming the town square into a theater of divine retribution. The purpose was twofold: to physically purge the corrupting evil from the community and to sear a terrifying warning into the collective memory of every witness. The event would have been scheduled for a market day, ensuring the largest possible audience. The stake itself, a thick wooden post, would be erected in the central square, surrounded by a pyre of dry faggots and straw designed to ignite quickly and burn intensely. The condemned would often be paraded through the streets in a procession known as the Amende Honorable, a humiliating journey meant to amplify their shame and signal their complete rejection by society. The Witch Queen, stripped of her former status, would be dressed in a simple, rough shift, often marked with a cross or other symbols. A cleric would walk beside her, offering a final, desperate opportunity to repent and save her soul, even as her body was condemned. This last-minute plea was a crucial part of the drama. A genuine confession of faith and renunciation of the devil at the final moment was seen as a partial victory for the Church, proving its power to reclaim even the most lost soul. However, any defiance or continued claims of innocence were interpreted as the devil's final, unyielding grip on her, justifying the horror to come. As the flames took hold, the spectacle was intended to be both cathartic and instructional. The crackling fire and the rising smoke were symbolic of purification, a belief that the elemental force of flame could cleanse the spiritual pollution the witch represented. For the terrified onlookers, many of whom genuinely believed the accused had blighted their crops and cursed their children, the execution offered a visceral sense of justice and closure. The destruction of the witch's physical form was the destruction of the evil she embodied, a promise that order would be restored and divine favor might return to the community. But beneath this surface of righteous purification lay a deeper, more cynical calculation for the authorities. The agonizing public death served as the most potent form of deterrence imaginable. The sight of a human being, once perhaps a respected figure, consumed by fire was a lesson written in pain and terror, a graphic demonstration of the ultimate cost of challenging ecclesiastical or political power. It was a brutal reminder that the price of heresy, real or imagined, was annihilation. Yet, even in this moment of ultimate condemnation, there are hints that public opinion was not always monolithic. While many in the crowd would have watched with grim satisfaction or superstitious fear, historical accounts from other executions suggest a more complex range of emotions. Some spectators might have felt a pang of pity, especially if they had known the accused in a different light, as a neighbor, a healer, or a benefactor. There are scattered records of executioners tasked with lighting the pyre, sometimes showing a shred of mercy by secretly hanging a small bag of gunpowder around the victim's neck, which would explode and bring a swifter, less agonizing death once the flames reached it. This clandestine act of humanity, a tiny rebellion against the official script of suffering, suggests that even in an age of profound superstition, the sight of a burning human could evoke empathy as well as fear. The public execution of the Witch Queen, therefore, was not a simple act of evil destroying evil. It was a multifaceted ritual of power, fear, and social control, a performance where the line between justice and brutality was consumed by the very flames it so fervently stoked. The immediate aftermath of the Witch Queen's execution was not a return to peace, but the deepening of a shadow. While the flames in the square may have died down, the fear that fueled them continued to smolder, now fanned by the grim precedent that had been set. Her case did not so much conclude as it did ignite, acting as a kind of dark permission for a wider wave of persecutions across Lorraine. Local authorities, emboldened by the successful prosecution of such a prominent figure, now had a template for identifying and eliminating supposed evil. The intricate web of accusations spun during her trial, the names of alleged accomplices extracted under torture, provided a ready-made list of new suspects. What began as a focused hunt for a single powerful witch rapidly metastasized into a broader panic, where old grudges and personal vendettas could be settled under the solemn guise of religious duty. A neighbor's envy over a better plot of land, a merchant's rivalry, or simply the strange behavior of an eccentric elderly woman could now be escalated into a formal accusation with deadly seriousness. The Witch Queen's story proved that no one, not even a noblewoman, was beyond the reach of such charges, making every soul in the Duchy potentially vulnerable. As the years turned into decades, the historical figure at the heart of the tragedy began to recede, and the legend of the Witch Queen grew to fill the space she left behind. Separated from the complexities of her real life and the political machinations that likely doomed her, the story was refined and reshaped by the oral tradition. It evolved into a potent cautionary tale, told and retold by generations of parents to their children, especially their daughters. The figure of the Witch Queen became a stark warning against stepping outside the rigidly defined social roles for women. Ambition, assertiveness, and particularly any display of knowledge or autonomy that challenged male authority could be framed as the first step on the path to dark powers. The story taught that a woman who sought power outside the home, who was too clever, too independent, or too curious, would inevitably attract the attention of the devil and meet a terrible end. This folkloric version of the Witch Queen was a tool of social control, ensuring conformity by perpetuating the memory of a woman who dared to be different and was utterly destroyed for it. Her presence also became woven into the very landscape of Lorraine. Certain locations took on a new, ominous significance. A particular gnarled tree in a deep forest might be pointed to as the site of her sabbat. A lonely, crumbling tower on a hilltop became known as her castle, a place to be avoided after dark. The story provided a supernatural explanation for local misfortunes for generations to come. If a well ran dry, it was because the Witch Queen had cursed it centuries ago. If a traveler got lost in the woods, it was said her spirit was leading them astray. This process anchored the abstract fear of witchcraft into tangible, physical places, making the legend a living part of the community's relationship with its environment. The folklore served a psychological purpose, offering a framework to explain the unexplainable and giving a name to the nameless anxieties that persist in every human society. Perhaps the most fascinating evolution of the legend is how it split into two distinct threads over time. In one version, she remains the archetypal villain, a malevolent, powerful sorceress whose spirit is forever bound to the earth, causing mischief and harm. But in another, more sympathetic retelling, a different narrative emerged, particularly among common folk. In this version, the Witch Queen transforms into a tragic, almost romantic figure. She becomes a woman who turned to dark powers not out of pure evil, but out of a broken heart, perhaps betrayed by a lover or seeking to protect her family from a cruel lord. Some tales even recast her as a vengeful spirit of justice, using her magic to punish truly wicked nobles and protect the poor. This duality reflects the complex relationship people had with the concept of power. The official story, promoted by the authorities, demanded a pure monster to justify the horror of the execution. But the unofficial, folkloric version sometimes allowed for nuance, recognizing that the line between villain and victim could be blurry, and that the same power that could curse could also, in the right hands, protect. The enduring legend of the Witch Queen of Lorraine is not a single story, but a prism through which we can see the enduring fears, desires, and moral struggles of the people who kept her memory alive. So where can we turn if we wish to find the real woman beneath these layers of legend? The quest for historical truth leads us to the archives, to the fragile parchments and faded inks that have survived the centuries. But this is not a straightforward investigation. The historical record for a figure like the Witch Queen is not a neat dossier waiting to be opened. It is a collection of fragments, whispers, and shadows, each document presenting its own set of challenges for the modern historian hoping to separate fact from fiction. The most crucial sources would be the official trial documents themselves. In an ideal world, these would provide a verbatim account of the proceedings, the specific charges, the names of witnesses, the evidence presented, and the final judgment. For some witch trials in Europe, such records do exist in remarkable detail. For the Witch Queen of Lorraine, however, the trail is far colder. We are more likely to find indirect references, a line item in a municipal account book noting a payment for the firewood used in an execution, or a brief entry in a church register recording the death of a noblewoman condemned for heresy. These dry administrative notes confirm that something happened, that a woman was tried and executed, but they tell us nothing of the drama, the accusations, or the identity of the accused beyond a name. It is like finding a receipt for a weapon without knowing the story of the crime it was used in. The chronicles of the time are another potential source, but they come with their own heavy biases. Monks and local historians often wrote with a specific moral or political purpose. Their accounts of the Witch Queen would be shaped by their desire to present a story that reinforced the power of the church and the moral order of the day. A chronicler might embellish the tale of her demonic pact to serve as a vivid warning to his readers about the dangers of straying from the faith. He might exaggerate her wealth and influence to frame her downfall as a triumph of divine justice over worldly arrogance. These narratives were not intended as objective journalism. They were morality plays written on parchment. Reading them requires us to read between the lines, to ask not just what the author is saying, but what purpose his story serves. Is he trying to please a patron? Is he seeking to explain a recent political upheaval? The chronicle entry becomes less a window into the event and more a reflection of the fears and priorities of the man who wrote it years after the fact. Perhaps the most tantalizing and most unreliable sources are the personal letters or diaries that might mention her. A nobleman writing to a colleague might make a passing reference to the scandalous trial of a local woman, revealing the political undercurrents of the accusation. But such documents are incredibly rare survivals from the medieval period, and even if found, they present a single, subjective viewpoint. A letter from a rival lord would portray her in the worst possible light, while a note from a sympathetic relative might have been destroyed to protect the family's name from the stain of association with a condemned witch. This creates a profound asymmetry in the historical record. The voices of the accusers, the judges, and the authorities are preserved in official documents, while the voice of the accused herself is almost entirely silenced. We hear the charges against her in vivid detail, but we never hear her own defense, her own explanation of events, her own story. The historical truth is filtered exclusively through the perspective of those who sought her destruction. This leads to the greatest challenge historians face, the problem of the coerced confession. As we discussed, the detailed accounts of sabbats and pacts that form the core of the legend almost certainly originated in the torture chamber. When a historian finds a trial record that includes a confession describing a flight to a sabbat, they are not reading an authentic account of a real event. They are reading a script that the interrogator and the victim composed together under duress. Therefore, the historian's task becomes one of reverse engineering. Instead of taking the confession at face value as evidence of witchcraft, they must analyze it as evidence of the interrogator's beliefs and the cultural stereotypes of the time. The specific details of the confession, the form the devil took, the nature of the blasphemies tell us nothing about what the accused actually did, but they tell us everything about what her society feared she might do. The document is a mirror reflecting medieval anxieties, not a transparent window into supernatural practices. Ultimately, the search for the historical witch queen is a lesson in humility. The hard, factual evidence about her life is so fragmentary and so corrupted by bias and violence that a definitive biography is likely impossible. We cannot know with certainty her true name, her precise motives, or the exact circumstances of her downfall. Yet, this very absence is itself a kind of historical evidence. The silence surrounding her personal reality speaks volumes about the power dynamics of her age. The fact that she was so completely erased as a person and rebuilt as a monster in the official record is a testament to the effectiveness of the persecution. The historical sources, for all their flaws, do not need to provide a clear picture of the woman to tell a powerful story. They reveal the brutal mechanics of scapegoating, the terrifying power of collective fear, and the ways in which history is written not by the victims but by the victors. In the end, the most truthful account of the Witch Queen of Lorraine may not be found in a single document, but in the unsettling space between them, in the ghostly outline of a life that was systematically dismantled and overwritten by a legend. The search for the Witch Queen moves from dusty parchments to the very soil of Lorraine, where archaeology offers a different kind of evidence, one that is silent but potentially just as revealing. While no excavation has ever uncovered a signpost reading Witch Queen's castle, the landscape is dotted with sites that local folklore insistently links to her story. These are not grand palaces, but often lonely, forgotten places, the crumbling foundations of a tower on a windswept hill, a particular cave system hidden deep within the Forêt de Reny, or an unusually shaped standing stone in a remote field. For generations, these locations have been known by names that whisper of the legend passed down through oral tradition. A local farmer might point to an overgrown ruin and call it La Tour de la Sorcière, the witch's tower, claiming it was her fortress. Such places become archaeological candidates not because of what has been found there, but because of the powerful, persistent stories attached to them. The challenge for archaeologists is to peel back these layers of folklore and see if the physical evidence beneath supports any connection to a historical figure from the witch trial era. The most promising and poignant possibility is the discovery of an unmarked grave, the execution of a condemned which was meant to be a complete eradication. She was often denied burial in consecrated ground, her body disposed of in a way that would prevent any memorial, and it was believed stop her malevolent spirit from returning. Historical records from other regions indicate that the ashes from a pyre were sometimes scattered in a river or buried at a crossroads, places considered spiritually ambiguous or profane. If the Witch Queen was burned, her remains would have been treated with similar contempt. An archaeologist might therefore look for anomalies in the burial patterns of a Lorraine cemetery from the correct time period. A single skeleton found buried face down, a traditional practice to prevent the deceased from rising, or a body interred outside the sanctified walls of a churchyard with a stake through its chest, could be a potential candidate. Finding such a grave would not confirm the person was a witch queen, but it would provide tangible proof of someone who was ostracized and feared in death, fitting the profile of such a victim. It would be a silent, somber testimony to the ultimate punishment. Beyond graves, the search extends to curious artifacts that might hint at the practices for which she was accused. Imagine an archaeologist carefully sifting through the soil of a modest medieval home site and uncovering a small, crudely fashioned clay figurine, its surface pitted with what appear to be tiny holes. In the context of the Witch Queen's legend, such an object would be electrifying. It could be interpreted as a puppet, the very kind of object used in Maleficia to harm a victim from a distance. Of course, the reality is almost always more mundane. The figurine could just as easily be a simple toy, a votive offering to a saint, or an object with a function we no longer understand. This is the central dilemma of archaeological evidence for witchcraft. It is almost always ambiguous. A bundle of specific herbs found buried under a threshold might be a protective charm or simply a method of insulation. A blackened cauldron could have been used for brewing healing remedies or, in the accuser's imagination, poisonous potions. An archaeologist can describe what they find, but they cannot recover the intention behind the object. The artifact only gains its meaning from the story we choose to tell about it. This is where archaeology and history must join forces in a fascinating, if cautious, partnership. A compelling scenario might involve the excavation of a site long associated with the Witch Queen in local lore. If archaeologists were to find evidence of a sudden, violent destruction layer, perhaps signs of a fire that was not accidental, or defensive walls that were deliberately torn down, dating to the precise period of the witch trials, it would add a powerful layer of credibility to the stories. It would suggest that something momentous and traumatic did happen there, Furthermore, if that site could be linked through property records to a known historical figure like Catherine de Hauville, the circle of evidence would tighten significantly. We would have a location, a name, and a folk tradition all pointing toward the same tragic event. The ruins themselves would become a physical anchor for the legend, transforming the story from a mere ghost tale into a narrative grounded in a real place and a tangible historical conflict. Ultimately, the archaeological pursuit of the Witch Queen teaches us a profound lesson about the nature of legends. We may never find a smoking gun, an artifact with her name inscribed upon it that proves every detail of the story. But archaeology is not just about proving specific events, it is about understanding the world that made those events possible. By studying the layout of a medieval village, the remains of a peasant's diet, or the fortifications of a local lord's castle, we build a vivid picture of the daily life, the fears, and the social tensions of the time. This context is perhaps the most valuable evidence of all. It shows us the cramped, vulnerable conditions that fostered suspicion. It reveals the stark divide between the powerful and the powerless that made scapegoating so effective. The true archaeological evidence for the Witch Queen, then, is not a single grave or a mysterious pot, but the entire material culture of 15th century Lorraine, a world where belief in dark forces was as real as the stones used to build its houses and the wood used to fuel its pyres. The legend persists because the soil from which it grew is still there, waiting to be read by those who know how to look. To truly appreciate the singular nature of the Witch Queen of Lorraine, we must step back and view her story as part of a much wider, darker tapestry. Across Europe, during the same centuries of fear, other powerful women found themselves branded with similar titles, their lives consumed by nearly identical accusations. By placing her alongside figures like Alice Kyteler in Ireland and the so-called witches of Belvoir in England, we begin to see that her case was not an isolated anomaly, but a terrifyingly common pattern, a script for destruction that was being performed on a continental stage. These comparisons reveal that the machinery of persecution operated with a chilling consistency, regardless of the specific name or nationality of the accused. Consider the case of Dame Alice Kyteler in Kilkenny, Ireland, in the early 1300s, one of the earliest and most well-documented witch trials in European history. Alice was a woman of immense wealth, having outlived 4 husbands, each of whom left her a portion of their fortune. Her story is a textbook example of how accusations of witchcraft were weaponized against female financial independence. When her stepchildren challenged her inheritance, they found a powerful ally in the local bishop, who leveled a catalogue of charges against her that are strikingly familiar. She was accused of denying the faith, sacrificing animals to demons, and using sorcery to gain wealth and influence. Most chillingly, she was said to have a demonic familiar, a spirit named Robert or Robin Artisan, to whom she made offerings. The parallels to the Witch Queen of Lorraine are profound. Both were wealthy, autonomous women who posed a threat to the established social and patriarchal order. In both cases, the allegations served a clear Chinese letter purpose, to strip them of their power and property. Alice Kyteler's story shows that the template for destroying a witch queen was already well established a century before the events in Lorraine, proving that the fear of a powerful woman could easily be translated into the language of demonology. Moving to England in the early 1600s, the case of the witches of Belvoir Castle offers another illuminating parallel, this time involving accusations against a mother and her daughter. Joan Flower and her daughters Margaret and Philippa were servants to the Earl and Countess of Rutland. After being dismissed from their positions, the family suffered a series of terrible tragedies, including the sudden illness and death of the Earl's 2 young sons. The Flowers were accused of witchcraft, with Joan allegedly declaring her malice before her death. The accusations here centered on classic maleficia, using witchcraft to harm children and sow discord within a noble household. While the social status of the accused was lower than that of the Witch Queen of Lorraine, the core dynamics are remarkably similar. The case demonstrates how witchcraft accusations could be used to explain personal and family tragedies, and how servants or dependents who fell out of favor could become convenient scapegoats for misfortunes that had no other apparent cause. The Belvoir case, like the one in Lorraine, shows how quickly suspicion could crystallize into certainty when directed at those already on the margins of power. When we line up these stories, a set of common patterns emerges with unsettling clarity. The first and most consistent pattern is the profile of the accused. Whether it was Alice Keiteler, the Witch Queen, or Joan Flower, these women were almost always individuals who defied easy categorization. They were often widows like Catherine de Hauville might have been, who controlled their own fortunes. They were healers or midwives with knowledge that set them apart, or they were outsiders, whether socially, economically, or ethnically. Their very existence challenged the rigid hierarchies of their time, making them vulnerable targets. The accusations themselves also followed a predictable script, heavily influenced by texts like the Malleus Maleficarum. The demonic pact, the nocturnal sabbat, the familiar spirit, and the specific acts of harmful magic are repeated like a ghastly refrain from Ireland to Lorraine to England. This consistency points not to a real, organized cult, but to a shared cultural nightmare, a standardized set of fears that inquisitors and accusers projected onto their victims. Furthermore, these cases almost invariably involved a powerful alliance between personal grievance and institutional authority. A disgruntled family member, a jealous neighbor, or a dismissed servant would provide the initial spark of accusation. But for that spark to become a conflagration, it required the oxygen of official sanction from the church or the state. A local bishop, a zealous landowner, or a complicit judge would then amplify these personal vendettas, transforming them into matters of high heresy and public safety. This collaboration between private malice and public power was the engine of the witch hunts. It allowed individuals to settle scores under the guise of piety, while allowing authorities to eliminate troublesome figures and reinforce their control. The tragedy of the Witch Queen of Lorraine, therefore, is not that her story was unique, but that it was horrifyingly commonplace. She becomes one face among many in a vast gallery of women who are transformed by fear and ambition from human beings into monstrous symbols, their individual lives erased to serve a narrative that was as politically useful as it was terrifying. Yet long after the flames had cooled and the political intrigues of her era faded into history, the story of the Witch Queen found a new and potent life, not in court records, but in the creative imaginations of artists and writers. The legend refused to be confined to the dusty pages of chronicles. It instead seeped into the cultural bloodstream, evolving and transforming with each new generation. It was during the Romantic era of the late 18th and early 19th centuries that her tale underwent its most dramatic and lasting reinterpretation. For the Romantics, who championed intense emotion, the sublime power of nature, and the individual spirit in revolt against oppressive institutions, the figure of the Witch Queen was a perfect muse. They looked past the simplistic demonology of the medieval church and saw in her a far more compelling archetype, the tragic, rebellious outcast. In the hands of Romantic poets and novelists, she was no longer a mere villainess but a complex, sympathetic figure. They reimagined her not as a servant of Satan, but as a free spirit who had turned to ancient, natural powers as a form of liberation from the stifling confines of a rigid, patriarchal society. A poem from this period might depict her not cackling over a cauldron, but standing alone on a storm-racked cliff, her hair whipping in the wind as she defiantly commands the elements, a symbol of humanity's wild, untamable soul confronting a cold and orderly universe. Her alleged pact with the devil was reinterpreted as a metaphor for a woman's thirst for knowledge and autonomy in a world that denied her both. The forest, once the terrifying setting for her sabbats, became a place of mystical communion where she communicated with the primal forces of the earth itself. This romanticized version shifted the audience's sympathy entirely, turning the Witch Queen from an object of fear into a heroine of individualistic rebellion, a proto-feminist figure crushed by an intolerant world. This new interpretation was given vivid form on canvas by romantic painters who are masters of mood and drama. A typical painting from this time might show the Witch Queen not at the stake but in a moment of eerie power. She could be portrayed as a pale, beautiful, and melancholic figure in a flowing dark gown, illuminated by the ghostly light of the moon as she gathers herbs in a misty forest clearing. The focus would be on her isolation and her connection to a sublime, untamed nature, with gnarled, ancient trees and brooding skies emphasizing her role as a creature of the wild, existing outside the bounds of civilized society. Other artists chose to capture the sheer spectacle of the supernatural, depicting her spectral flight across a star-strewn sky, a distaff in hand soaring over the sleeping villages of Lorraine. These images were designed to evoke awe and a shudder of fascination, not pure terror. They celebrated the very elements that the medieval church had condemned, finding beauty in the dark, mystery in the forbidden, and a kind of noble grandeur in her defiance. Alongside these high art interpretations, the legend continued to thrive in the oral culture of the common people through folk ballads. These songs, passed down through generations in taverns and around hearths, often preserved a more ambivalent and sometimes darker view. A ballad might begin by recounting her terrible crimes in a chilling verse, describing the curses she laid upon the children of a cruel lord. But then, in a sudden and poignant shift, the chorus could twist into a lament sung from her own perspective, mourning the love she lost or the injustice that drove her to darkness. This duality in the ballads is fascinating. They functioned both as a warning and a secret expression of empathy. For the peasantry who still lived with real hardships, the Witch Queen could be a figure of terror one moment and a symbol of vengeful justice the next, a powerful spirit who used her magic to punish the wicked aristocracy who oppressed the poor. This folkloric version was less concerned with philosophical ideals of rebellion and more with the raw emotions of loss, anger, and a desire for retribution. By the Victorian era, the legend underwent another subtle shift, reflecting that age's preoccupations with morality, gender, and sensationalism. Gothic novelists latched onto the tale, amplifying its horror elements for maximum thrills. In these stories, the Witch Queen became a more overtly sinister and sensual figure, a deadly enchantress whose beauty was as dangerous as her magic. The focus was often on the corruption of innocence and the supernatural as a threat to the established social order, a theme that resonated with Victorian anxieties. Yet, even here, a strand of sympathy remained, often centered on the trope of the tragic romance, the idea that a broken heart was the true source of her descent into darkness. This constant reinterpretation across centuries demonstrates the incredible plasticity of the legend. Each era molded the Witch Queen to fit its own fears, desires, and cultural debates. She served as a blank canvas upon which societies could project their deepest anxieties about female power, their fascination with the occult, and their complex relationship with authority and rebellion. In our own time, the legend of the Witch Queen has undergone perhaps its most profound transformation, as modern feminist scholars and thinkers have revisited her story, peeling back the layers of demonization to uncover a powerful narrative about gender, power, and resistance. This reinterpretation asks us to fundamentally shift our perspective. Instead of viewing her through the accusatory lens of the 15th century church, we are encouraged to see her as a complex woman whose story was systematically distorted by the very patriarchal structures that felt threatened by her existence. From this viewpoint, the charge of witchcraft ceases to be about supernatural evil and becomes a recognizable political tool, a label applied to women who dared to defy the narrow confines of their prescribed roles. The feminist analysis begins with a critical examination of the profile of the typical accused witch. As we've seen, the victims were overwhelmingly women, and often women who existed on the edges of male control. They were widows who managed their own property, healers who possessed knowledge independent of male authorities, or simply women who were too outspoken, too independent, or too inconvenient. Feminist historians argue that the witch hunts were not a random outbreak of superstition, but a systematic campaign of terror aimed at enforcing gender conformity. In a society where a woman's value was tied to her silence, her obedience, and her role as a wife and mother, any deviation from this script could be interpreted as a sign of diabolical influence. The Witch Queen, in this light, becomes the ultimate example of this phenomenon. Her alleged power to control whether to curse male potency to lead a female-dominated coven can be read not as literal magic, but as a patriarchal nightmare of what happens when female autonomy goes unchecked. Her story is a cautionary tale told by the powerful to the powerless, a warning that any woman who stepped out of line could be named, tried, and destroyed. This perspective powerfully reframes the idea of the demonic pact. Where inquisitors saw a satanic bargain, feminist interpreters see a metaphor for a woman's conscious rejection of a society that offered her no legitimate path to power. Swearing allegiance to the devil can be reinterpreted as a symbolic act of renouncing the authority of a church and a state that denied her basic rights. The powers she allegedly gained, invisibility, flight, the ability to influence the powerful, are reimagined as the fantasies of liberation for a woman trapped in a rigidly hierarchical world. The nocturnal Sabbat, with its descriptions of dancing, feasting, and sexual freedom, can be viewed not as a blasphemous orgy, but as a symbolic space of female community and ecstatic release from the drudgery and oppression of daily life. In this reading, the Witch Queen is not a monster. She is a figure of resistance, a woman who, in the imagination of her accusers, claimed a form of agency so potent that it could only be explained as originating from the ultimate source of anti-authoritarian power. This modern reclaiming of the witch archetype has resonated deeply in contemporary culture, transforming her from a historical victim into an icon of empowerment. The phrase, "the future is female," finds a dark ancestral echo in the figure of the witch, who is now frequently celebrated in art, literature, and social movements as a symbol of environmental wisdom, bodily autonomy, and resistance to patriarchal control. Modern paganism and feminist spirituality often embrace the witch as a positive identity, honoring her as a keeper of herbal lore and a guardian of feminine mysteries. This cultural shift is not about believing in literal magic, but about recognizing the enduring power of the symbol. The witch's broomstick, once a tool for supernatural travel, is now seen as a symbol of sweeping away old, oppressive structures. Her cauldron represents a vessel of transformation where new ideas and possibilities can be brewed. The tragedy, of course, is that this empowering symbol is built upon a foundation of real historical suffering. The feminist reinterpretation does not erase the horror of the Witch Queen's probable fate. It amplifies it by highlighting the profound injustice. It asks us to mourn not a mythical sorceress, but a real woman who was likely tortured and killed for the crime of being too assertive, too knowledgeable, or simply too difficult for the men around her to control. Her story becomes a bridge connecting the persecutions of the past to ongoing struggles for gender equality today. When we see the Witch Queen as a victim of patriarchal violence, her legend ceases to be a simple ghost story and becomes a sobering reminder of the high cost of silencing women's voices, a cost that continues to be paid in different forms across the world. Her enduring legacy, then, is dual-natured. She is both a warning from history about the dangers of scapegoating and a beacon of resilience. A spirit that refuses to be burned away, forever rising from the ashes to challenge the authorities that seek to confine her. Looking at the legend through a modern psychological lens offers a startlingly clear explanation for how such a terrifying figure could be conjured from thin air. The phenomenon we're observing here aligns powerfully with the concept of mass psychogenic illness, more commonly known as mass hysteria. This occurs when the anxiety and stress of a community manifest as physical or psychological symptoms that spread rapidly through a group, often in the absence of any real physical cause. Think of the medieval Duchy of Lorraine not as a collection of irrational individuals, but as a single, traumatized organism. This was a society still reeling from the collective trauma of the Black Death, living with the constant threat of famine and the instability of borderland politics. Their world was fundamentally unsafe, and their suffering needed an explanation that was more satisfying and more tangible than random chance or an abstract punishment from God. The human mind has a profound need for narrative, for cause and effect. It is far less terrifying to believe that your child's fever is the result of a specific, malevolent intelligence that can be identified and destroyed than to accept that illness strikes arbitrarily without reason or mercy. The Witch Queen provided that narrative. She became the focal point for a society's diffuse and overwhelming anxiety, a single villain onto whom every unexplained tragedy could be projected. This process is deeply intertwined with the sociological mechanism of scapegoating. In times of intense social stress, when a community feels threatened from within or without, there is a powerful impulse to locate a culprit, a sacrificial figure whose punishment will purify the group and restore a sense of order and safety. The criteria for a scapegoat are very specific. The ideal candidate is someone who is already perceived as different or who holds a marginal status within the community, making them an easy target. They often possess some form of power or knowledge that sets them apart, which can be quickly reframed as a threatening or unnatural ability. A wealthy widow, a knowledgeable healer, or an outspoken woman. Each of these profiles fits the pattern perfectly. By collectively accusing, trying, and executing this scapegoat, the community engages in a violent ritual of purification. They are not just killing a person, they are symbolically destroying the evil they believe has infected their world. The public execution of the Witch Queen was the climax of this ritual, a gruesome ceremony designed to convince everyone that the source of their misery had been found and eradicated, offering a cathartic, if illusory, promise of a return to safety and divine favor. We can understand this further by considering the work of psychologists like Gustave Le Bon, who studied crowd psychology. He observed that individuals in a crowd can experience a kind of psychological contagion, where emotion overrides reason and a collective mind emerges that is more primitive and more prone to suggestibility. The rumors about the Witch Queen did not spread through careful consideration. They spread like a virus, leaping from person to person in the charged atmosphere of the village square or the Sunday sermon. In this state, the most fantastical story becomes plausible because the fear of being outside the group, of being the only one who doubts, is more powerful than the fear of the alleged witch herself. Conformity becomes a survival instinct. To question the narrative is to side with the enemy, so individuals suppress their private doubts and publicly endorse the growing hysteria, which in turn makes the delusion appear even more unanimous and therefore more true. From a cognitive perspective, this entire episode is a masterclass in confirmation bias. Once the initial suspicion was planted that the noblewoman or healer was a witch, every subsequent event was interpreted through that lens. If she offered an herb that healed someone, it was luck or a trick. If the person later took a turn for the worse, it was proof of her malicious magic. A sudden storm was no longer a weather pattern, it was her summoned tempest. This biased filtering of information creates a self-sealing system of belief. There is no way for the accused to prove their innocence because both positive and negative outcomes are twisted into evidence of their guilt. The psychological need for consistency and the desire to avoid the cognitive dissonance of admitting a terrible mistake made it almost impossible for the accusers to reverse course once the process had begun. The legend of the Witch Queen, therefore, is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a stark, timeless lesson in the terrifying power of collective psychology, showing how easily fear can forge a monster from a human being when a society desperately needs someone to blame for its pain. Yet, perhaps the true secret to the legend's endurance lies in its profound ambiguity. The story of the Witch Queen is not a simple parable of good versus evil. It is a narrative riddle that refuses to offer a single, comfortable answer. Was she a malevolent sorceress or a political victim, a healer unjustly accused or a woman who truly sought forbidden power? This lack of resolution is not a weakness but a source of perpetual fascination. Our minds are drawn to mysteries that defy easy categorization, and the Witch Queen exists in that tantalizing gray area between history and myth, between monster and martyr. She is a mirror, and each generation that gazes into her story sees its own fears and desires reflected back. In an age obsessed with female empowerment, we see a proto-feminist rebel. In times of political conspiracy, we see a pawn in a grander game. Her story is a vessel, empty yet capacious, waiting to be filled with the anxieties and questions of the present day. She is a shape-shifter, eternally adapting to remain relevant, her legend proving that the most powerful stories are not those that give us answers, but those that compel us to keep asking questions. To walk in the footsteps of the Witch Queen today is to embark on a journey through a landscape where history and folklore are inextricably woven together. The modern region of Lorraine, with its rolling hills and deep, silent forests, is dotted with locations that local tradition insists were the stages for her dark drama. While the historical evidence may be faint, the power of place is undeniable, and visiting these sites offers a tangible connection to the legend that no parchment can provide. Let's begin our virtual tour in the heart of the ancient woodlands, in the legendary Forêt de la Reine, the Queen's Forest. This vast expanse of oak and beech stretching across the French countryside is more than just a scenic backdrop. For centuries, it was the dark, impenetrable wilderness that pressed in upon isolated villages, a place of both practical resources and profound supernatural dread. It is here, along overgrown paths and in shadowy clearings, that people believed the Witch Queen and her coven held their blasphemous sabbats. If you were to walk these trails today, the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy and the eerie quiet broken only by the snap of a twig, it's not difficult to understand how such stories took root. The forest feels ancient, alive with a presence that defies explanation, a perfect canvas for the medieval imagination to paint its darkest fears. Venturing out of the deep woods, our next stop is perhaps the most iconic location tied to the legend, the Château de Cirque les Bains. Perched dramatically on a rocky outcrop overlooking the Moselle River, this fortress's rugged silhouette seems to embody the very essence of a medieval stronghold. While no documents directly link a specific Witch Queen to its stones, Cirque les Bains fits the archetype perfectly. It was a strategic border castle, constantly contested between powerful factions, a place where political intrigue and shadowy dealings were a matter of course. Local lore claims that its deepest, coldest dungeons once held the accused queen before her trial. Standing on its ramparts, looking out over the valley she might have surveyed, you can feel the weight of its history. The castle isn't just a ruin, it's a character in the story, its imposing presence a silent testament to the kind of isolated, powerful seat from which a figure of such feared authority could have ruled or been accused of ruling. From the castle, we travel to the more intimate but no less charged setting of a town square, perhaps in a place like the historic village of Rodemack, known as La Cité des Jardins. It is in communal spaces like these that the legend transitions from whispered secret to public spectacle. The main square of any medieval town was the center of social life, a place for markets, celebrations, and public announcements. But it was also the stage for the ultimate act of communal purification, the execution. While no specific plaque marks the spot, tradition in many Lorraine towns points to the central square as the likely site of the pyre. To stand there now, surrounded by half-timbered houses and the chatter of daily life, is a haunting experience. It forces a stark contrast between the normalcy of the present and the horror of the past. This is where the abstract fear of witchcraft became terrifyingly real, where the story reached its brutal, public conclusion, an event meant to sear a warning into the memory of every witness and cleanse the community of its perceived evil. This blend of history and tourism creates a unique form of what we might call dark heritage. The sites associated with the Witch Queen are not celebrated in the way a royal palace or a cathedral might be. Instead, they are preserved as places of memory and reflection where we can contemplate a darker chapter of human history. For the modern visitor, these locations offer more than just a ghost story. They provide a visceral understanding of the medieval world, its fears, its social structures, and the brutal consequences of superstition. Walking through the Forêt de Lorraine, you feel the isolation that bred paranoia. Exploring the Château de Cirque-les Bains, you grasp the political power dynamics that could turn a woman into a target. And standing in a quiet town square, you are reminded of the fragility of justice in an age of fear. These places are the real archives of the Witch Queen's legend, silent stones and ancient trees that hold the echoes of a story which continues to captivate and caution us centuries later. The transition of the Witch Queen from a figure of historical persecution to a modern pop culture icon is a fascinating evolution, one that sees her dark legend reborn in the vibrant landscapes of video games, the immersive pages of fantasy novels, and the dramatic visuals of television and film. In the 21st century, this medieval archetype has been unshackled from the grim specifics of Lorraine and refashioned into a powerful symbol of complex female authority, often embodying our contemporary anxieties about power, morality, and redemption. A prime example of this reinterpretation can be found in the sprawling, critically acclaimed video game series The Witcher. While not a direct adaptation, the universe created by Andrzej Sapkowski and brought to life by CD Projekt Red is steeped in the very same Central European folklore that gave rise to the Witch Queen legend. Characters like Yennefer of Vengerberg and Triss Merigold are modern heirs to this tradition. They are sorceresses of immense power, operating in a morally grey world where their abilities set them apart and make them objects of both fear and desire. They are not simple villains, they are fully realized individuals with ambitions, vulnerabilities, and a fierce autonomy that would have been unimaginable in the original medieval narratives. The games explore the political intrigue and social ostracism these powerful women face, directly mirroring the historical context of the Witch Queen while granting them agency and depth far beyond the one-dimensional evil of the past. This trend extends beyond gaming into the realm of prestige television, where the archetype has found a powerful new canvas. The character of Melisandre, the Red Priestess, in the global phenomenon Game of Thrones, embodies several key aspects of the Witch Queen mythos. She is a foreigner with mysterious powers, arrives at a royal court, and exerts a profound influence over a king, Stannis Baratheon, convincing him of a divine destiny. Her ability to birth a shadow assassin and her unwavering faith in her god paint her as a figure of immense, unsettling power, much like the historical accusations of demonic pacts and maleficia. Yet, the series also delves into her humanity, her doubts, and her ultimate role in the fight against a greater evil, complicating the audience's perception of her. Similarly, the Netflix series The Witcher presents its own version of this archetype, not only with Yennefer but also with lesser sorceresses who navigate the treacherous politics of the continent. These modern interpretations are less concerned with the literal truth of witchcraft and more interested in using the figure as a lens to examine themes of belief, manipulation, and the dangerous allure of absolute power, whether it be magical or political. Beyond direct fantasy analogues, the 21st century has also seen a wave of narratives that actively seek to reclaim and redefine the witch archetype, transforming her from a victim into a heroine of her own story. This is powerfully evident in a novel like The Once and Future Witches by Alex E. Harrow, which reimagines witchcraft as a source of communal strength and feminist resistance. In this telling, the knowledge of herbs and spells is not a pact with the devil but a suppressed lineage of female wisdom, a direct challenge to patriarchal authority. This aligns perfectly with the modern feminist re-evaluation of the historical witch trials, viewing the accused not as evil sorceresses but as women persecuted for their independence or their knowledge. The Witch Queen, in this context, becomes a symbol of a lost matriarchal power, a figure to be celebrated and resurrected rather than feared. This shift reflects a broader cultural movement to re-examine history from the perspective of the marginalized, giving voice to those whom the official record sought to silence. The portrayal of these powerful figures has also evolved to explore far more nuanced moral landscapes. The classic binary of good versus evil has given way to a compelling shade of gray. Modern audiences are drawn to anti-heroes, and the Witch Queen archetype fits this mold perfectly. She is often portrayed as an antagonist with understandable, even sympathetic motivations. Perhaps she turns to dark magic to protect her family, to avenge a great wrong, or to survive in a world that has offered her no other options. This complexity makes her a far more interesting and memorable character. We see this in characters like Circe from Madeline Miller's novel of the same name, who transforms her exile on an island into a journey of self-discovery and empowerment, wielding her magic not for petty malice but as an expression of her own identity and sovereignty. This reimagining invites us to empathize with the so-called monster, to question the narratives constructed by those in power, and to consider the circumstances that can lead a person to embrace a path others deem dark or forbidden. The enduring power of the Witch Queen of Lorraine lies in this incredible adaptability. She is a vessel into which each new era pours its own unique blend of fears, aspirations, and evolving understandings of power, justice, and the complexities of the human spirit. And so we reach the end of our journey into the shadows, leaving the misty valleys of Lorraine behind, but the figure of the Witch Queen remains, an indelible silhouette against the backdrop of history. Her story is not a single thread but a tangled web, woven from the very real fibers of political ambition, deep-seated superstition, and the raw human instinct to find a scapegoat for unbearable suffering. We have seen how a world shattered by plague and haunted by the unknown desperately sought order, and in doing so created a monster from the raw material of a woman's life. The legend is a chilling reminder that history is not just a record of what happened, but also a story of what people believed and the actions they took based on those beliefs. It shows us that the line between justice and persecution is often terrifyingly thin, drawn not by truth but by fear. What does this enigmatic tale ultimately tell us? It speaks volumes about the mechanics of fear itself. Fear of the other, fear of female power, fear of a natural world that could not be controlled. These anxieties were the kindling that allowed the spark of accusation to become a conflagration. The story of the Witch Queen reveals how easily a community can be persuaded to turn on one of its own, to see a neighbor as a demon, when the alternative is to confront the unsettling chaos of a random and unforgiving universe. It is a stark lesson in how fragile justice becomes when it is filtered through the lens of collective paranoia, and how the very institutions meant to protect can become the engines of oppression when fueled by dogma. Her legacy forces us to confront the timeless human tendency to create monsters. We fashion them from our deepest anxieties, giving a face and a name to the formless threats that plague us. In the 15th century, that monster was a witch. In other times and places, it has taken different shapes. The process, however, remains hauntingly familiar. Identify the outsider, amplify their differences, and construct a narrative of their inherent malevolence to explain away our own misfortunes. The Witch Queen of Lorraine is one of history's most poignant monsters because the evidence suggests she was, in all likelihood, a woman of flesh and blood, whose real story was consumed by the legend she came to represent. So we are left with the lingering question that has hovered over this entire mystery, a question that perhaps has no single answer. What do you believe? When you look past the flames of the pyre and the whispers of the chronicles, who do you see? Was she a malicious sorceress who truly wielded dark powers, a figure of genuine evil who met a just end? Or was she a cunning political pawn, a piece sacrificed in a high-stakes game of power between lords and bishops, her destruction a convenient way to settle a secular score? Perhaps the most compelling interpretation is that she was simply a tragic victim, a woman whose intelligence, independence, or mere misfortune made her the perfect target for a society that had no room for women who defied expectation. Her story belongs to all these possibilities, and it is in the wrestling with these questions that her true power lies. She is a mirror, and in her we see reflected our own understandings of power, fear, and the stories we tell to make sense of a complicated world. The Witch Queen's voice may have been silenced centuries ago, but the questions her life and death provoke continue to echo, demanding